Now, in the previous exercise and in the previous slides, we described a relational data source. Now, that data source won't do us any good unless we have a data set that specifies what data on that relational database we're trying to retrieve. So the data source specifies the database. The data set specifies which subset of the data on that database we're retrieving. The relational data set is actually going to perform a SQL query. SQL stands for Structured Query Language. It's it's basically a standard for talking to relational databases. Now, if you're familiar with our Pi process book, ODBC datasets, you'll notice these are very similar to that. Let me switch over to process book and show you. Within a process book trend, you can specify, instead of a Pi tag, a data set. And that data set can be, among other things, it can be an ODBC retrieval. So as you can see, this right here is the data source. This tells me which source out of all the possible sources in the world we're retrieving from. But then this is actually the SQL query that tells us what to get. That's going to be similar when working with this data set in RT Web Parts. So let's talk just a second about structured query language. Let me move back there. SQL is basically a standard protocol for accessing and manipulating database systems. Obviously, if you wanted to, you could learn an awful lot more about SQL than you'll need to make the simple statements we do in this class. But basically, suffice it to say, we do adhere to standards. So we do allow you to make use of these SQL statements to get data into RT Web Parts. And part of SQL is the support for placeholders. Now, we're not going to talk a lot about placeholders. The placeholder character we use with RT Web Parts or with SQL is the question mark. It's where we can basically substitute a parameter so that, and we'll show an example of this later on. That, for example, you can have a parameter passed from one web part to another in a data set such that clicking on one web part will initiate a connection to a second web part passing a placeholder, being a string or a value or something like that, and then that will have an effect on the second web part. So we'll see an example of that. But in our first example, what we're going to be looking at, real simple example, it's going to be this select statement. This is a SQL query. It's going to be going against a Northwind database. Actually, the Northwind database we set up in our previous exercise. We set up a connection, a data source to that Northwind database. Now we're going to tell, using a data set, we're going to tell RT Web Parts, or this particular web part, which data on that particular data source we're trying to view.